history. We often think of it as, well, fixed, set in stone, a story everyone sort of agrees on. But what if it's not? What if huge parts of it were, well, rewritten, not just seen differently, but actually changed?
It's a really unsettling thought, isn't it? And today we're diving deep into exactly that kind of challenge. We're looking at the new chronology theory, specifically how it applies to Russian history. Our main source here is the, let's say, highly controversial book, The Issue with Russian History, by Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovskiy. They're mathematicians, interestingly enough.
Right, mathematicians, not historians in the traditional sense. So our mission today, for you listening, is really to unpack their claims. They argue that so much of what we think we know about early Russian history, ancient, medieval, is just fundamentally wrong. We'll look at their methods, these mathematical approaches, and also, importantly, the really strong pushback they get from mainstream historians. This isn't about us saying they're right or wrong, but helping you understand this. Well, this pretty radical challenge to how history is usually written.
Yeah, and the first big shock from their perspective is this idea that history before maybe the 15th, 16th centuries, basically before printing really took off, is incredibly fuzzy. They describe it as vague, convoluted, basically a story put together much later by historians, not based on genuine old documents. They take aim at the standard timeline, the one traced back to scholars like Scaliger and Batavius in the 16th, 17th centuries, saying it's just full of massive errors.
Okay, so let's get concrete. One of the biggest targets for the reevaluation is something central to Russian identity, the so-called Mongol Yoke.
The story we all learned, right? Invaders from the east, conquering Russia, a period of oppression. That's the standard narrative. But Fomenko and Nosovskiy, they point to things they see as major inconsistencies. Take the Cossacks, for example. Traditional history often places their emergence around the 17th century. But Fomenko and Nosovskiy highlight evidence suggesting they were around much earlier, maybe 12th, 13th century. And crucially, they ask, where are the records of fighting between these Cossacks and the supposedly foreign Mongol horde? They argue there just aren't any significant ones.
Interesting point. So, if there's no conflict, what's their alternative explanation?
This is where it gets really, really radical. They propose the Cossacks weren't invaded. They were the horde, or at least a core part of it. They argue that the word horde, or orda in Old Russian, didn't mean foreign invader. It just meant army. Like the regular state army.
The state army?
Yes. And they point to things like Russian folk sayings, even into the 19th century, where Khan and Tsar were apparently used almost interchangeably. That hints at a domestic ruler, not a foreign one.
Wow, okay. That completely flips the script. What kind of evidence do they actually muster for such a, well, counterintuitive claim?
They bring together quite a few different strands. For instance, they mention notes from a Hungarian king, a letter to the Pope, that seemed to indicate Russian troops were in Batu Khan's army, fighting alongside them.
Not just conquered subjects, but active participants.
Exactly. Collaboration, not just subjugation. They also claim the whole governing system of the Golden Horde was basically run by Russians. And then there's the religion aspect, which is fascinating. An Orthodox church was apparently built right in the Khan's main headquarters very early on, and Orthodox churches popped up all over Horde territory. The head of the Russian church, Metropolitan Cyril, was even moved back to Kiev, kind of restoring the old church structure under supposed Mongol rule.
That really doesn't fit the image of brutal conquerors stamping out local traditions.
Not at all. And it goes further. Think about infrastructure. The Russian postal system, the Yamshiki, the coachman network. Fomenko says this was set up by the Mongols. But the coachmen themselves, the guys running it day to day, they were Russians.
Why would an occupying power rely so heavily on the locals for something so vital?
Good question. And this ties into another puzzle they raise, the silence in Russian chronicles. While foreign accounts sometimes describe the Golden Horde as basically a Russian state, Russian sources from that period, well, they seem to go quiet. It's almost like Fomenko argues the chroniclers didn't even know their country was supposedly conquered by this massive foreign empire. That discrepancy is key for them.
Okay, so textual evidence or lack thereof. What else?
They also look at maps and names. There's an 18th century map labeling Asiatic Russia as Great Tartary. They interpret this as the foreign name for Great Russia. And the name Karakorum, supposedly Genghis Khan's capital way out east, they claim it appears on some old maps right in the Don region of Russia.
Suggesting the center of power was much closer to home.
Precisely. But maybe the most startling claim in this section is about direct manipulation of texts. They point to a specific chronicle, the Lavrentievskaya Letopis, dated 1337, a foundational text. and they claimed that the specific pages describing the Tatar-Mongol conquest, pages 153 to 164, are replacements, physically inserted later, forgery.
Wow. Not just interpretation, but physical tampering. That's a huge accusation against a primary source.
It is. And this reimagining extends to the people involved. Their theory posits that Batu Khan was actually the Russian prince Yaroslav.
The Yaroslav.
Yes, and Alexander Nevsky, Yaroslav's famous son, was Batu Khan's adopted son. They connect the name Batu to the Russian word Batya, meaning father or dad, a term sometimes used for Cossack military leaders, a familiar commander, not a foreign invader.
That's quite a linguistic link they're drawing. And what about the tribute, the Tartar tribute?
The 10th part, Russia supposedly paid. They argue that was just the standard Orthodox Church tax, the desyatina, a tax used to support the regular Russian army, the Horde, which, as a military force, wasn't allowed to farm and needed state support. It makes the tribute seem like an internal tax, not foreign plunder.
Okay, and you mentioned place names earlier.
Right, the word Saray, meaning depot or palace, pops up a lot in Horde history. They note many Russian towns, particularly along the Volga, have Tsar in their name, Sertov, Saransk, Tsaritsyn. They suggest these were military supply depots for this integrated Russian army, this Horde. Even Sarajevo in the Balkans potentially fits.
And this integrated view extends to foreign relations.
Apparently so. They cite a 16th century Ottoman Sultan Selim or Suleiman explicitly telling his forces not to attack Muscovites because they were great allies, which seems odd if they were recently conquered enemies.
It does seem odd. And the battles against Tartars later on.
Yeah, in the 16th century, the battles consistently happened near Moscow or the Oka River, the new chronology interpretation. These weren't defensive wars against foreign invaders. They were punitive actions by the central Russian state, the Horde army, against rebellious subjects. Internal conflict, not external war.
So this whole Mongol Yoke narrative, according to them, is a later construct, which leads perfectly into their next big claim about the Romanovs.
Exactly. This radical retelling of the yoke is crucial groundwork for their accusation against the dynasty that came later.
Right. So now we get into what feels like maybe their most direct accusation of historical fabrication. They claim the Romanov dynasty, the ones who took power in 1613 after the Time of Troubles, basically wrote the first draft of the Russian history we know today. And that draft was deliberately skewed.
Yes, their argument is the Romanovs had a strong pro-Western agenda and needed to erase the previous power structure, this integrated Russia horde. They claim the Romanovs systematically drove the Cossack horde out of central Russia, pushing them to the edges, like Kazakhstan, which they interpret as meaning Cossack camp. And after crushing Cossack-led rebellions like Ryazan's and Pugatyov's, the Romanovs allegedly went back through official records and labeled the horde as foreign evil, basically rewriting them as invaders.
And how did they achieve this rewriting, according to the theory?
Well, one striking event they point to is the alleged burning of genealogical chronicles in 1682. This was under Fyodor Alexeyevich, Peter the Great's older brother. Fomenko and Nosovskiy see this not as an accident, but as a deliberate destruction of records to clear the way for the Romanovs' own preferred lineage in history.
A controlled demolition of the past, so to speak.
That's the idea. And it fits, they argue, with the Romanovs' generally pro-Western, or as they put it, purely Teutonic policies. They note that things like religious persecution of Muslims and Jews who wouldn't convert really kicked off under the Romanovs, which was different from the supposed religious tolerance of the earlier Mongolian era.
But weren't the Romanovs also trying to find historical records?
Yes, but Fomenko and Nosovskiy spin this differently. Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich ordered a chronicle office set up in 1657 to, compile history, continue the official book of ranks. But the clerk in charge, Kudryavtsev, apparently couldn't find any records for the past 100 years, not even the book of ranks itself.
No records.
According to their sources.
Yeah.
Fomenko asks, if the records were missing then, where did all the detailed ancient chronicles we have now come from? They must have been written or heavily edited after Kudryavtsev's search failed.
So the scarcity of records was the opportunity to create new ones.
That's the implication. They also point to Peter the Great's order in 1722. He told all churches and monasteries to send their chronicles to Moscow for copying. Fomenko and Nosovskiy are deeply skeptical that the originals were ever returned. They see it as a kind of state-sponsored purge of inconvenient historical narratives.
Okay, so if the old records were gone or altered, who wrote the new official history?
This is another key point for them. Foreigners, specifically Germans like Gerhard Friedrich Miller, August Ludwig von Schlosser, and Gottlieb Siegfried Bayer, along with Patashev, who they argue was heavily influenced by them. They pose the question quite sharply. Are there any other European countries where the history of the state would be written by foreigners exclusively?
Implying that these foreigners wouldn't have the local knowledge or loyalty to resist a state-directed narrative.
Precisely. They highlight Miller, for instance, as supposedly having to bring back copies of chronicles from Siberia because he couldn't find old ones in capitals. And they mention he allegedly swore an oath not to reveal state secrets about Russian history. Secrets about what, they ask.
And Tatishev, often called the first Russian historian.
Fomenko notes that even Tatishev found the primary chronicle, the Povest Vremeni Let, unreliable. Tatishev used other sources, 14th, 16th century archives from places like Kazan and Astrakhan archives, which are now conveniently lost. His work was suppressed, they claim, and he was sidelined. Why? Because, they argue, those lost archives contained the true history of Russia Horde, which contradicted the emerging Romanov version.
So the theory is the Romanovs deliberately chose pliable foreigners.
Yes, foreigners who would be more obedient, didn't know the language well initially, weren't emotionally invested, and would basically follow orders to construct a history that suited the Romanov pro-Western agenda. This isn't just error, it's presented as a deliberate, state-sponsored campaign of falsification.
It's a very strong claim. Were there no Russians pushing back at the time?
Well, they do mention a skeptical school, emerging in the early 19th century. Professor Nosovskiy, for example, who apparently described the ancient chronicles as a mix of fact, myth, and outright forgery. So the idea that these texts weren't entirely reliable wasn't invented by Fomenko. There was earlier skepticism.
Which leads us neatly to one specific chronicle they really focus on, the Radziwiłłskaya Letopis.
Yes, this manuscript is absolutely central. It's often held up as the oldest surviving illustrated Russian chronicle, maybe from the 15th century. It's foundational for our understanding of Kievan Rus'.
For mainstream history, it's a cornerstone document, but Fomenko and Nosovskiy see it very differently.
Very differently. They point to what they consider obvious physical evidence that it's much later. For instance, the page numbering. It has both Arabic numerals and Older Church Slavonic numerals, and both systems seem to have been added after the book was already bound. Plus, some pages are out of order. This suggests to them it was bound only once, presumably when it was first created, not rebound later.
Okay, page numbering. What else?
Watermarks on the paper. They claim the first few pages have watermarks that clearly date them to the 18th century, not the 15th. Even the famous bull's head watermark, often used to date paper to the 15th century, they argue is unreliable here, or maybe even faked to make the paper look older.
Faked watermarks.
That's the implication. And they build on earlier work by N.A. Morozov, a Russian scientist who was a major influence. Morozov noted that all the existing copies of the Povest Vremeni Let, the primary chronicle text contained within the Radziwiłłskaya and others, look remarkably similar. He suspected they all came from a single workshop, maybe in Königsberg, around the time a popular printed edition came out in 1767. The point is, the physical evidence screams 18th century, not 15th.
Okay, so physical anomalies.
Yeah.
But they also claim specific content was manipulated, right? The Norman theory page.
Yes, this is crucial. They identify one specific page, page 8, in Arabic numerals, page 9 in Church Slavonic, that looks physically different. Ragged edges, clearly inserted later, maybe even has a later note attached to it.
An insert. And what's on this inserted page?
The famous story, the legend of the Varangians, the Scandinavians, being invited by the Slavs to come and rule over them. Our land is vast and rich, but there's no order in it. That story. The absolute bedrock of the Norman theory of Russian origins. Exactly. Fomenko argues this one inserted page serves two main hoaxes. First, it legitimizes the Romanovs' own pro-Western northern origins. Second, it helps relocate the historical Great Novgorod away from Yaroslav on the Volga, where Fomenko claims it originally was, up towards Scandinavia, fitting the Norman narrative.
And they even have an anecdote about hiding this alleged forgery.
Yes, about the library director Olenin, back in the day, apparently refusing to give the manuscript back to the Academy of Sciences. They interpret this as an attempt to keep the original away from scrutiny, to hide the inserted page.
It doesn't stop there, does it? There's another inserted page.
Right, another one they claim was fortunately found later. This page conveniently lays out the entire chronology of early Russian history, neatly linking it all up with Scaliger's global timeline.
So a cheat sheet for Russian history, basically.
Essentially, yes. They argue this page was absolutely vital for creating a coherent, but, in their view, false historical timeline, and that the hoaxers handled it very carefully.
So the bottom line on the Radziwiłłskaya Letopis, according to the new chronology.
Their conclusion is stark. It was manufactured, probably in Königsberg, early 18th century, maybe commissioned by Peter the Great himself. It was created specifically to be the missing ancient original source needed to validate the Romanov version of Russian history. An 18th century fake passed off as 15th century truth.
That is quite the accusation. Okay, let's zoom out a bit now. We focused on the Russian aspects, but this new chronology is much bigger, right? It applies to all of world history.
Oh, absolutely. Fomenko's claims are global and arguably even more radical when applied worldwide. He fundamentally argues that reliably documented human history only starts around AD 800. And even then, the period from 800 to 1000 AD is almost a blank slate. Most historical events we think of as ancient or early medieval actually happened, he claims, between AD 1000 and 1500. Everything before that is just phantom reflections. Later events mistakenly projected back in time or duplicated accounts of the same events.
Phantom reflections. So ancient Greece, Rome, all phantoms.
Largely, yes, or duplicates of medieval events. This leads to his theory of a single massive empire, this Slav-Turk-Russian horde dominating Eurasia way before the 17th century. Groups we think of as distinct and sequential Scythians, Huns, Goths, Mongols, Cossacks are all sort of collapsed into being part of this one huge, long-lasting entity.
That's mind-bending. And what about specific famous figures and places?
Here's where it gets extremely controversial. They propose, for example, that the historical prototype for Jesus Christ was actually a Byzantine emperor, Andronikos Hyrcanemos, who lived in the 12th century. Jesus, they argue, is a composite figure reflecting Andronikos and others. And places like Jerusalem, Rome, Troy. They aren't fixed ancient locations. They're placeholders that could refer to different cities at different times, often Constantinople, Rome, or even Moscow, as the capital of the Russian horde.
And the Bible itself.
They claim the New Testament was written before the Old Testament, and that the Bible as a whole was being written and compiled right up until the Council of Trent in the mid-16th century.
Okay. This is a complete demolition of conventional history. How on earth do they justify these claims? They talk about scientific methods, right? Mathematical ones.
Yes, that's their big selling point, applying mathematical and statistical analysis to history. One core technique is what they call statistical correlation of texts. They basically quantify historical narratives, how much space is given to certain rulers or events, assuming more important things get more text. Then they compare these patterns across different historical accounts. For instance, they claim the narrative structure of ancient Roman history shows a suspiciously high mathematical correlation with medieval Roman history.
Suggesting one is just a copy of the other.
Or both are copies of some other original. Yes, that's the inference they draw. They find these duplicates all over history.
And they do something similar with dynasties.
Right. Statistical correlation of dynasties. They create numerical codes for rulers based on things like how long they reigned, how they died, who their successors were. Then they run statistical comparisons across different dynasties, even those separated by centuries or vast distances, like the kings of Israel and the Holy Roman emperors. And again, they claim to find strong mathematical correlations, leading them to conclude these are just different versions of the same ruling sequence, phantom dynasties.
Mathematics, texts, dynasties.
Oh,
What else? Astronomy.
yes, astronomy is another major pillar. They famously redated Ptolemy's Almagest, the ancient star catalog. Based on analyzing the star positions for proper motion, they claim it couldn't have been compiled in antiquity, but likely dates from the 15th or 16th century, using observations from maybe 600 to 1300 AD.
That would completely upend the history of science?
Absolutely. They also reinterpret astronomical depictions in ancient artifacts, like the Dendera zodiacs from Egypt. They argue the astronomical alignments shown actually date them to the 11th, 13th centuries AD, or even later, not ancient Egypt. They even try to date biblical events astronomically, linking the Star of Bethlehem to a documented supernova in 1140 AD, the crucifixion eclipse to an eclipse in 1170 AD. And they redate eclipses described by the ancient Greek historian Thucydides to the 11th century, implying Thucydides lived then, not in ancient Greece.
Okay, so to make all this work, the math, the astronomy they have to reject the standard dating methods historians and archaeologists rely on, don't they? Carbon dating, tree rings.
They absolutely do. They essentially dismiss all conventional dating methods for periods before the 11th century as fundamentally flawed. Archaeology, dendrochronology, tree ring dating, radiocarbon dating, paleography, study of old handwriting. They label them all non-exact and contradictory.
What are their specific criticisms?
Well, for dendrochronology, they say it's only a relative method. It relies on already having an established chronology to anchor the tree ring sequences. It can't create one from scratch, they argue. Radiocarbon dating. They claim it's inherently inaccurate, especially for older periods, and even accuse labs of basically fudging the results to match historians' expectations, getting the dates to order, as they put it.
That's a serious charge against scientific practice.
It is. And numismatics, dating based on coins, they dismiss that as circular reasoning, arguing that coins are often dated based on historical assumptions, not independent evidence.
So they reject basically all the standard tools. Unsurprisingly, how does the mainstream academic world react to the new chronology?
With almost universal rejection, it's widely labeled as pseudohistory and pseudoscientific within academic circles, particularly by historians, physicists, and mathematicians who've actually examined the methods.
What are the main criticisms from academics?
Critics accuse Fomenko and his colleagues of serious methodological errors. Things like manipulating the data to fit the desired outcome, selectively choosing evidence that supports their theory while ignoring vast amounts that contradict it. They argue the statistical correlations Fomenko finds are often artificial, created by how he defines the parameters, and don't hold up under rigorous scrutiny. They say he finds patterns where none really exist, or exaggerates minor similarities.
Like finding faces in the clouds?
Kind of. The prominent Russian archaeologist Valentin Yanin famously dismissed Fomenko's work as akin to the sleight-of-hand trickery of a David Copperfield, a performance, not science.
And the sheer scale of the conspiracy required.
That's another huge stumbling block for critics. Fomenko's theory implies a deliberate, coordinated global effort lasting centuries before 1600, roughly to fabricate almost all of recorded history. Countless documents supposedly edited or completely fabricated, countless others systematically destroyed, all across the world by different cultures and powers, all somehow conforming to the same false timeline. Most scholars find that premise simply unbelievable, historically and logistically impossible.
Right. It requires an almost unimaginably vast and successful conspiracy. Okay, so just to bring this all together, the new chronology is this incredibly ambitious, radical attempt to rewrite basically all of human history, especially Russian history, using mathematical methods. It claims our established timeline is wrong, that major events and empires are duplicated phantoms, and that much of history was deliberately forged, particularly by the Romanovs in Russia.
That sums it up pretty well. It's a complete overhaul based on methods that mainstream academia largely rejects, and proposing a level of historical conspiracy that most find untenable.
It certainly makes you think, though. Even if you completely reject the theory, it forces you to confront how historical narratives are built.
Exactly. It raises profound questions about how we know what we know about the past. If narratives can be challenged so fundamentally, even if the challenge itself is flawed, what does that mean for our confidence?
How do we really separate historical fact from the stories we tell about it? It's definitely something to mull over, something to chew on as you go about your day.